Record. Great. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this webinar about the principles of excellence and how some campuses, one in particular we'll be highlighting today, the University of Colorado Denver, is moving forward with responding to some of the tracking and reporting requirements coming down the line for student veterans specifically. My name is Stephanie Schooley. I'm Executive Director of Campus Compact of the Mountain West. And we, along with California Campus Compact, began in the fall a series of webinars, one per month, focused on content that we were hearing from campuses would be particularly relevant, that they wanted to hear about. Not all of it has to do with student veterans, but this is one space in which CCMW, in which we work. We also do webinars around engaged campus work, around tracking systems, not just for student veterans, but for engagement across institutions. There's really a wide variety of information and content that we try to share nationally. So we have our thanks to California Campus Compact for partnering with us in this endeavor. Let's change the slides. There we go. So before we get started really quickly, I want to make sure that everyone that's on the call as a participant knows how to interact and how you can make your voice heard, which is kind of funny because you're in a listen-only mode, but and then how you'll be receiving follow-up information following the webinar. First of all, you'll see two buttons that should be a part of your Zoom platform. One is a chat button, which I see that John Sweet has already figured out how to use. And really through that button, you can post comments, things that come up for you during the webinar, or if you wanted to share examples from other campuses, oh, such and such campus does this really well, to really contribute to the conversation. And those chats are recorded as part of the webinar. So it's a great way to kind of keep a record of ideas that come out that can help contribute, because we know that there's expertise in the participants as well. So please feel free to use that chat function. The second one is a Q&A button, and we're going to make sure we leave a good chunk of time at the end of the webinar after our facilitators go through and share their brilliance with you, so that you can ask questions specific to your institution, your office, your community, and really make sure that this webinar is giving you the information that's going to help you specifically in doing what you do for your campus. So in that Q&A box, please, throughout the webinar, post questions that you would like to have answered. And then again, when we get to the end, we'll make sure that we get those questions directed to our facilitators. Following the webinar, we'll send out an email to all of you that participated, and it'll have a link to a brief evaluation, just making sure that if there's a way we can do this better, we do it. We're all about continuous improvement. There'll be a link for this presentation on YouTube. We have a Campus Compact of the Mountain West YouTube channel, so you can go through and review this webinar along with lots of other ones if you have abundant free time on your hands and want to spend it that way. And we'll also attach this PowerPoint. So you will have these slides that contain all of the links and information that our facilitators will be talking about. So don't worry if it's going too fast or if you're not able to write down website addresses, etc. All of them are embedded links, so you can just click around on here after you receive it. Great. If you need anything, that's where you can reach me. And I'm the one that sent the email, so you know where to get me. Moving forward, really quickly, I want to introduce our facilitators and go through the structure of what they'll be sharing with you today. And then I'll do an overview of who Campus Compact is, especially Campus Compact of the Mountain West, what our second mission initiative looks like, because that is a part of that program. And then we'll roll into Katie Klein-Hesselink, who is the Director of Member Services for Campus Compact of the Mountain West. And she also, as part of her very long job title, directs all of our second mission programs. So she will be sharing just an overview of the principles of excellence and the reporting that sort of follows from those principles. Then we'll move to Patrick Brown, who's Director of the Veteran Student Services Office at the University of Colorado, Denver. And Patrick is going to share just an institutional perspective, what his office does, is responsible for, some of the challenges and goals that they have moving forward as a student veteran success office. And then we will have Daryl Gottwald, who is an AmeriCorps Vista member and student at the University of Colorado, Denver, and who has really been responsible for crafting this process rationale, et cetera, and the tools for collecting and understanding what this data could look like and what the next steps are for using it after it's collected. So that is going to be the flow of the webinar today, and then after Daryl speaks, we will have question and answers. So to get started, and just very briefly, because many of you probably are familiar with Campus Compact since you probably got this message through your affiliate. Campus Compact of the Mountain West is one of, can you see that, Katie? I can. Okay, just one second. Can you share? Better? Yeah. Okay. Campus Compact of the Mountain West is an affiliate of a national organization. The Campus Compact Network focuses on working with colleges and universities really to promote civic learning and engagement in higher education. So going back to the public purposes of higher education, our goal is to work across the campus, so with faculty and staff, with students, with community partners, with campus leadership, to embed engagement and engaged practices, whether it's in courses, so through service learning opportunities, through community-based research opportunities, or in co-curricular programs like alternative spring breaks, anywhere where students have the opportunity to work and serve in communities, and that's contributing both to their educational experience and to their sort of general citizenship development. Campus Compact of the Mountain West, we work specifically in Colorado and Wyoming, and we have 19 colleges and universities that are part and parcel of our membership. One of our specific programs is the Second Mission program, and the SEC in Second Mission stands for Service, Education, and Careers. Beginning in 2013, we started hearing from faculty and staff on campuses that they were experiencing and seeing a pretty dramatic influx of veterans in their classrooms and on their campuses, and didn't feel like on several of the campuses there was a really sufficient infrastructure and programs and services to be able to know what to do to provide and ensure that those students were having a positive experience, were being retained on their campuses, and were able to successfully graduate and transition into the civilian workforce. So Campus Compact of the Mountain West began working with campuses across our membership and asking the question, is community engagement a tool through which we could address some of these issues? So whether it's getting veterans and military family members involved in national service programs like AmeriCorps, like our Second Mission Vista program, or previously our Veteran Leader Corps program, or looking at veterans and the arts, which we've gotten involved with. Some of our past programs, and you can look at this all online, have had to do with some of that community engagement through veteran artist programs and opportunities. This is really where Campus Compact of the Mountain West spends its time in the veteran space. We are not a veteran serving organization, and we have sort of a more limited scope. But our goal is to provide as much support as we can to campuses as they do the really hard work of ensuring that there's student success and persistence to graduation for student veterans. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Katie Klein-Hesselink to talk about the principles of excellence, and go to the next slide.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. So I just wanted to briefly introduce the principles of excellence, which I imagine most of us on this webinar are familiar with. They came out of an executive order back in 2012, and so there's no surprise, I think, too, in terms of timing, that our program started to drop around 2013, as these had been around for a while. And the main purpose, of course, of the principles of excellence is more transparency in terms of helping veterans make informed decisions about what schools they'll be attending, where they can go and succeed and find gainful employment following their academic experience. Compliance with the Principles of Excellence is noted on the GI Bill comparison tool and also on College Navigator. And while compliance is strongly encouraged, it's not currently required. Next slide, please. Great. So what this means in practice is that schools need to track the data that you see here. So while this may on its face not seem particularly complicated, it certainly can be given the ways that we track retention and persistence in terms of the IPED system. And so one of the outcomes of a program that we run, Second Mission Vista, has been to help provide campuses with the support to begin to figure out not only how to find this data, but tease out veterans' profiles for their institutions from that. And so we've been really happy to work with University of Colorado Denver on that endeavor. And at this point, I'll turn it over to those folks so they can tell you how it works.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks for everyone for being on this webinar today. Again, my name is Patrick Brown. I am the director here at the Office of Veteran Student Services for the University of Colorado Denver and the Anschutz Medical Campus. Currently, we have around 1,100 veteran students or military-related students, active duty, reserve, National Guard, and veteran, and another 200 students that are identified as spouses and dependents. Most of them are on some sort of education benefit. That's partly the reason we track them. So in Bring It On Dale, one of our goals was basically to expand and improve our student data collection efforts. In the past, there was different avenues that we could obtain this data. We weren't able to verify it, and it wasn't a direct reflection of our student population. Part of that being, and I'm sure you guys have these challenges as well, we weren't really confident that we were capturing the entire picture of our campus. We do have some places or some things in place so students can self-identify. Obviously, we can help self-identify through education benefits, scholarships, things specific to veterans, but a lot of them were slipping through the cracks. And a lot of the different schools have different kind of admissions process from undergrad to graduate. Again, like I said, we also support the Anschutz Medical Campus. Each individual college out there does their own thing in terms of tracking these students. And the reason we want to track these students is the main one is to have a better understanding of the educational outcomes of our students so we can adjust our programming to that. We get questions all the time from different people wanting to know retention, graduation, student counts. We also understand, like Katie was saying, that in the future, the VA is going to want a lot of this data, and it's going to come directly from our office, which is a good thing because some of the other places they were pulling data doesn't necessarily reflect the true numbers. One example is at the community college level in terms of graduation rates and stuff like that. And so that was definitely a big issue. The third one is we work a lot with private donors and foundations and corporations, and one of the first questions they ask is information about our student population. And then finally, obviously, programming needs in terms of, is there enough students on campus to fit this need? And so those are kind of the main goals of why we wanted to start collecting this data. Obviously, there's been many challenges, and Daryl will kind of expand on this more. I think the biggest challenge we faced was access. Data sometimes on universities can be very protected, and we wanted to make sure we were getting access to the correct data, but there was a little bit of pushback. And then obviously, with him being a Vista, he wasn't a university employee, so getting the access to the systems to pull some of this data. So some of the other challenges we're looking for is what data are we looking for? how is this data collected and where's it coming from? Who's reporting it and is it accurate? I could just say one thing we identified through one of the admissions processes is self-identifying it's volunteer and it's not required. We were having a lot of international students that didn't quite understand the admissions process and application, selecting that they were a veteran. And so that kind of skewed our numbers as well. And then finally, what is the data telling us? What are we trying to learn from this data? What does that
Great.
mean?
Thank you, Patrick.
All right, now we do musical chairs here a little bit.
You're very coordinated.
So we've had practice. We were here at 7 o'clock this morning practicing the move. All right, I'm getting settled here in front of the camera. First of all, thank you everybody for participating in this. My name is Daryl Gottwald. As Patrick had said, I'm the VISTA here for his office, Office of Veteran Student Services. A little background about myself. I am a veteran, and I was a vet in school in the 1970s. That was my initial attempt to get educated. And I'm currently a student in the Business Analytics program in the business school, getting a master's in that field. And I'll be graduating here this spring. First off, let me just make a personal remark. The climate here on campus is quite different than even my experiences when I was an undergrad student here at UCD as an engineering major, even 20 years ago. And certainly it's very, very different than the climate that I experienced at the University of Oregon when I was a biology major out there, and that was back in the 70s. And I think one of the things that's happened is that's really been caught up in a lot of, I don't want to use the word fear, but a lot of the apprehension, perhaps it's media driven. All the time we're seeing things that are happening on campus. Anytime a school has a shutdown or a lockdown, it's literally national news. And I think it's making a lot of people really jittery. And as a consequence of that, veterans are getting pulled into the whole mix of this sort of thing. And I think it's very unfortunate focus on veterans. We're not really any different than anybody else that's on campus. So that's my personal spiel on that. To go into my VISTA assignment very quickly, I had basically 3 objectives to try and accomplish during my tenure as a VISTA. The first was to create a uniform set of data tools to collect and track information on student veterans. Number 2 was to develop a comprehensive facility or faculty training program that describes and addresses in broad terms the veteran population at University of Colorado here at Denver. And the third one was to develop peer-to-peer mentoring program, support programs for incoming veterans. I've had pretty good traction on the first 2. The third one, when I hand off the baton to the next VISTA that comes in here in April, that gentleman will be focusing on the third point here. So I came in and basically I was given a blank sheet and said, okay, go out and fulfill your VISTA requirements. And I was thinking, all right, how am I going to do this? I don't know anybody. I know nothing about how data is collected, how it's stored or whatnot. So after I went through all the various trainings that's required to get access to data, specifically FERPA, which is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. I'm sure most members of this audience are familiar with that. Once I did that, it was just a matter of just starting to poke around and see what was out there. It's kind of like finding a thread, pulling it a little bit, and then just unweaving the yarn a little bit and seeing what comes out in the end. So initially I had a little bit of success profiling students in terms of what the veterans were, typical age, typical years of school, and then from there I was taking those veteran profiles and then comparing it with the students at large. There are some similarities, there are some differences, some significant differences, I think, that can give insight to the veteran on campus. And probably the biggest one is quite simply, veterans are older. They're maybe around 10 years older than typical students if you look at averages. And in the academic world, that's literally a generation apart. So what's more important here? Are we looking at generational differences, or are we looking at differences because veterans come from a different culture? I think maybe that's one of the questions that needs to be booted around a little bit. And then also too, in terms of my reporting, I found myself having to be very careful about how I was reporting the data, how I was keeping the data. There's all sorts of rules and regulations about not having sensitive data on your laptop. You have to be careful with that. And as I was going through this, I realized that maybe the best thing to do is not to do the heavy lifting myself, but rather to enlist the aid of the various IT departments on campus here. So that basically was my next step. In my experience, I've had some very positive, very helpful results with just basically sending emails out to people and say, hi, my name's Daryl, I'm at Vista, this is what I'm trying to get done. Can you spare an hour of your time? And everybody says, yes, we can do that. It might take a little bit of time to get into their office, but once you're in, once you explain what they're trying to do, the source of help and the enthusiasm and support's just been tremendous. And I think IT can really be a very positive partner in this entire endeavor. And whenever possible, make relationships with your IT people and don't be afraid to ask them questions. Even if the question appears reasonable, it may not be all that unreasonable. And if it is an unreasonable question, then maybe the gears can start moving where they transition from, we can't help you right now, to a point a little later on where they say, we've given it some thought, we think this is something that we need to embrace. As you can see on the slide here, there are some partnerships that I was able to establish: institutional research for effectiveness, enrollment and retention, disability resources and services. And it's from these people that I have found out what their mission is and what their requirements are in the academic world. As I'm flipping to my next slide here. How are we doing here on time? Are we ready to go to the next slide? Okay, all right. So forgive me if I'm speaking to the choir here a little bit, but this is all kind of new information for me. So I'll just kind of run through this a little bit and not dwell on it too much. Most institutions here in Colorado, they're Title IV funding, and they have reporting requirements. And most of you are familiar with the requirements of sending information out to the feds, so your campus is qualified to receive financial aid support that you can offer the veterans in terms of loans and whatnot. What's developing is a subset of that. A lot of the reporting requirements, they're kind of like standard. They're processes that are pretty much flat across the whole scope of the university reporting structure. And now what's happening is there's a little bit of a change, and there's some requirements that are getting layered onto this. And those requirements are for agencies that are specifically concerned with what's going on with the veterans. They want to know what the reporting is on the veterans at their end. That's basically a subset of what's happening for everybody else. One of the issues is when you take the student population in general, you're making some certain assumptions about that population. The veterans don't necessarily fit into those assumptions, and so the reporting methods that you have in place may not be an accurate way of actually fielding the correct numbers that represent the veteran population. I'm trying to build relationships with the various reporting agencies here, where we are going back and revisiting reports that do exist, asking the questions: are they really accurate? And if they're not accurate, why? And can we get consistency upon all the reporting structures that we have here in campus. And then from there to try and go and directly address those VA requirements that are coming down the pike, which pretty basically are the same as the VA as the recording for or reporting requirements for the population in whole, but is a subset for them. And that's a new focus for some of the IT agencies that we have here on campus now. So that's a work in progress. So a lot of this motivation is simply trying to meet the federal requirements as we're seeing them and as we understand them, and try and get something back to the various agencies that are interested in our outcomes. And then inevitably there's going to be feedback back from these agencies saying, well, what about this? How do you know this is really accurate? What sort of data auditing are you doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And that's just part of the life cycle of data, taking data and turning it into information. As you can see on the slide here, UCD benchmarks a couple times per semester since this data and after grades are posted, but also within that is other cycles that relate to the various operations of the institution, such as financial aid. Also, too, there are some state agency requirements here in Colorado. I'm not really familiar with those requirements yet, but I've been told that that's also part of the requirements that the various groups have to adhere to. So are we ready for the next slide?
Sure. Daryl, would you mind if I ask you a clarifying question at this point? I know not to ruin your flow here, but...
No, that's fine. Please. Thank you.
So when you are looking at the data that already exists, this is coming from, and that's institution-wide, correct? And it's not through surveying or data that's being collected specifically through the student veteran office, correct?
That's correct. You know, there's just kind of like this grand trying to sweep up of the numbers to fulfill internal requirements for the university. Academic and financial and staff decisions are being made all the time, you know, as university as an enterprise, and of course some of the support for these decisions are coming from the student data, and also too data is being recognized as part of the raw materials to feed back into the great system of the feds want to know what's going on there. In terms of, let's say, social sciences or medical or mental health or anything else like that, I really don't think, certainly not here at UCD that I'm aware of, that there's anything that's being done in that regard. Everything that we get at in terms of academic performance or whatnot is kind of inferred from that general pool of data that we have available that was created to fulfill other requirements. So that's also a talking point right now with these various IT departments, is how can we better the academic experience? And of course, part of that is how can they do better in the classroom, turn in better grades, succeed academically in terms of getting to their goal, which is going to be a degree in a reasonable amount of time. But there are probably also other things that contribute to what we would call the academic experience. How well they interact with professors, how well they interact with other students, emotionally, how satisfying was their time in the classroom as they pursued their academic goals. That, I think, is another level of investigation, and a lot of work needs to be done in that corner to try and get data that's accurate and relevant, and also to respects the privacy of those people that we're actually trying to survey and do analysis on.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to move along to the next slide, which will give some examples from UCD from reporting.
All right, here's a little something that I got from the IT department, and it's
Institutional research.
Yeah, it's the institutional research folks, and first of all, you'll take a look, you'll notice that it's kind of old. I mean, the most recent information there is 2007, and of course, that's 7-8 years ago. So here's what the report is trying to do. The report is trying to say, all right, we grabbed a bunch of cohorts. We identified these people as student veterans that started taking classes in the year 2003, and we're just earmarking these people, and we're following through and seeing how well they do in terms of fulfilling their graduation requirements or graduation rates. So we start out in 2003 with about 617 vets identified, and then the report just goes ahead and lists some numbers there. So immediately, for a lot of us, there's a big challenge of, all right, I'm looking at the numbers, exactly what kind of information am I to get out of this? And so you can spend a lot of time staring at this and trying to infer something that's useful out of this. As a data analyst, one of the simple tasks I have is simply to take information that you're seeing there right in front of you right now and put it in some fashion that makes sense and is digestible and offers information quickly. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide on this. So here we have simple bar charts that were just lifted right out of that report page that we just saw previously, and we can see some information here very quickly. At the start, we had about 617. Within 4 years, or at the 4-year mark, we look at counts of actually who graduates from school. So at 4 years, you can see maybe around 20% of the students have graduated, and then maybe that kicks up to around 40% at the end of 5 years. And then you can see from the bar chart on the top that if you're going to graduate, you're probably going to do it within about 5 years. 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, maybe there's going to be a very few people that graduate, but the numbers are saying not a significant number of people are going to graduate. So at 5 years, either you got it in the bag or you don't have it in the bag. But there's going to be a twist in this, which I'll talk about here in a second. The second chart actually will expand on that information a little bit, and within that, we start with the cohorts again. That's 617. That's at the far left-hand side. But rather than doing the accumulation that we did on top, we just take the snapshot for every year. At 4 years, give me the count. How many students graduate? 5 years, give me the count. How many students graduated? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as you can see, for all those students that graduate within this 8-year time span, the time span that most of these, or the majority of these students, or the greatest number of these students will graduate is 5 years. So there's a we're satisfying some intuition here where we're looking at what these veterans are doing here. And from these two graphs alone, we're getting some important information, and that information is, oh, they're moving along in a rate that's typical for the population at large. So, you know, in this regard, performance of veterans doesn't seem to be too much difference than performance of non-veterans. Now, I do want to make a couple of remarks about the information that's being presented here. First, we take a look at that 617 that we initially started out with. I don't have any data from the year 2003, but in taking a look at the numbers that we have currently in terms of what we're capturing, that number seems awfully low. I would think that in reality there might have been 800, 900 students that were actually vets on campus, but they're not being captured in this method of trying to track veterans. And then also too, we look and we see at the end of 8 years, there's about 52% of the students that didn't graduate. What we don't know is what was the ultimate outcome of their educational experience. All we know is they didn't graduate from UCD. Did they transfer out and get degrees elsewhere? This is important information, but the way the report was structured and put together, that's information that's escaping us right now. So that's one of the efforts that we're doing right now is to try and capture all those relative numbers in a more comprehensive fashion. So one, we actually know who's doing what on campus, and two, so we have a better idea how we can compare the veteran numbers with some of the other numbers that we have. Okay, I think I explained that one adequately.
Daryl, we have a question I'm going to go ahead and ask now because it relates to what you were just talking through on this graph. How do you factor in transfer credits that veterans students begin with in years to completion? So if they're transferring in with prior learning credits, do you know how that impacts the years to graduation?
We do have some information on that. It's ad hoc information though. And what we find is typically students come in with about a year of college elsewhere. According to Patrick, typically that's from the community college environment. And once they're in, their profile is very similar to other cohorts that would be at the same position in terms of hours earned. So if you have a student that comes in, let's say with a year of community college, a typical graduation rate would be 4 to 5 years from that time that they're in, which would pretty much line up with what everybody else is doing. But now the important thing to realize here is the only students that we're really capturing on an official basis, that is the numbers that we're creating, the reports that we're creating, that we're pushing back to federal agencies, are those students who come into UCD as entering freshmen and have their entire academic career here at UCD and then come out of the academic pipeline with a degree from UCD. Is that very typical in the year 2016? I suspect not, but that's how the reporting is done, and it's done to try and compare apples to apples. Will the feds evolve that method of reporting over time? Perhaps, I don't know. But at our campus, that really doesn't, that reporting style and that reporting structure really doesn't give us a lot of insight to the veterans. And for that matter, it may not be giving very good insight to anybody.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge we've been facing. We are not your typical campus. We are considered a commuter campus, and a majority of our students are coming in as transfer students. And so that's some of the challenges we're facing with the collaboration with other entities on campus that do some of this reporting.
You know, it seems like it's almost a catch-22 for institutions like yours or a community college setting where, you know, you don't have as much of the traditional 4 or 5 years start to finish, then you're out with a degree. Because in your effort to collect more accurate data, I mean, it may end up, because of the way the system is structured, without being able to capture some of these transfer in and out students that could still be considered a success if you were looking at it for full numbers. You almost get dinged for it, right? Because the numbers will always appear to be much lower than what is real on your campus. If you're counting, for example, this subset of student veterans, you probably are missing a whole group of them that are transferring one way or the other.
Right. You know, in these efforts, depending on who your audience is for the analysis, and that's always a very strong consideration when you go into these sort of things, the best information may not be the right information.
Yeah, especially if you're looking at funding. Okay, great. One more question and then we'll move forward. So how on your campus do you define veterans? And do you include active duty in your data sets?
Let me answer this one real quick. And this is and I apologize, we are trying to get away from using the word veterans. And so we like to use the word military affiliated. Obviously we have, in our system, there is a group of selections that can be made. I think it's a list of around 12 at this point. We try to limit what selections we use because they have a lot of different selections and some can be redundant in terms of, for instance, one of the options is Operation Enduring Freedom, and then another option is veteran. Obviously, one person could fall into both options. And so we code them in the system, and we do count all military affiliated students. Obviously, you can imagine we do have a pretty good size active duty population with the military bases that are close, definitely out at the Anschutz Medical Campus. and then that's a challenge we've faced lately. Is we weren't aware of a good portion of our active duty students because their education benefits was through an ROTC program or an Army scholarship. And again, the admissions process is different at the medical school versus the downtown campus for undergraduate programs. So it's definitely a challenge. But yeah, when we say veteran, I definitely would want to refer more to military-related students.
And let me just kind of throw in a remark here while I'm thinking about this a little bit. UCD is part of a 4-campus conglomerate, and we share database resources with Boulder, with Anschutz, and with Colorado Springs. There happens to be some of that database resource that is allocated for what we like to think of as our veterans in the form of tables that are buried deep somewhere. Now, here's a little bit of a tricky sort of thing is when you go into a database and you're trying to pull stuff out, you're basically going to pull stuff out of one or more tables, and then you're going to aggregate that information, that data, in a certain sort of fashion in a report. Well, as it turns out, each campus will go and create their own reports, even though they're accessing tables that are being shared by all 4 campuses. And over the course of time, these things evolve. They can become top-heavy. They get redundancies in terms of the information or columns that get put into these tables. So somebody at UC in Colorado Springs can reach out and grab something that looks good to them in terms of a variable or a column. Somebody in Boulder goes into that same table looking for the same information, but they may find another column that they think works best, and they pull that one out. So you create these reports that, even though they come from essentially the same kind of information or the same storage of information, they don't line up because they're grabbing different aspects of that. And nobody really talks to anybody about this sort of thing. It's not that we're having border wars or anything like that, but there's in the everyday conversion of data into information, there's just not a lot of crosstalk between the various campuses on how we're going about this. And this is one of the things that we're trying to address now. This is something down the future, but is it possible that within Colorado and Wyoming institutions we can get some coherence on how we're pulling this information out, so we can really have some accurate and dependable and reliable comparisons from campus to campus to campus. If we were trying to do that right now, I would say, fine, we can compare the reports, but I'm not at all sure that the reports are comparable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Daryl, I can't believe you're suggesting that higher education is siloed. I can't. Okay, I'll keep my cynicism under wraps. Here, I'm going to move us along to the next slide, and then we can go through some question and answers. Thanks for folks that have been submitting those along the way. Feel free to keep posting your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll be able to have a conversation after Daryl finishes this next piece. Take it away.
Okay, so I think I talked a little bit about these talking points here just a few seconds ago. I think one of the things that's really important is that transparency business. Within the IT departments, I think there's a natural reluctance to let people through the door. What they like to do is stand there at the door and say, okay, tell us what you want, and we're going to work really hard to get you what you want. And then in the world of things, people go, okay, thanks a lot, and they go ahead and get this stuff for you, but it's not necessarily transparent. It's not consistent, and your interpretation of the various requirements might be different than their interpretation. So there has to be more of a sense of openness, and I don't think the institutional lack of openness is necessarily because people are afraid to share information or are afraid of criticism from outside agencies. I think because of FERPA, there's just an institutional and legal reluctance to say too much about how these data are being dug out and being presented. And in the end, that might actually be a very, very wise and very cautious way of approaching things. So in time, if we are going to present information to the VA and Boulder is going to present information to the VA, it's inevitable that the VA is going to come back and ask questions that are essentially saying, okay, what's happening in Boulder? What's happening in Denver? There appear to be differences. We would like you to explain those differences. Before we can start doing that, you need to be able to look at the differences and say, okay, these are legitimate differences because we're reporting the numbers in a consistent and a fashion that can be replicated. So, and then once you have this kind of information, then you want to take that information and present it to interested parties and constituents on campus. And gee, faculty might just happen to benefit from some of the things that we're learning from this sort of stuff. But as it stands right now, the whole reporting process, I think, is very different than faculty interaction. The faculty interaction is more of a in-your-face sort of thing. We have student veterans in the classroom, and we're having all sorts of reactions here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how can we tie their experiences into the research that we're doing in a broader fashion? And then maybe too, in time, we actually start pursuing some information that goes beyond the information that we're collecting for requirements to reporting agencies, the feds and whatnot. So there's a lot of information networking that probably should be done. With time, we'll get to some of it, but in the meantime, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect here between the things that we're doing in terms of data research as advocates for the students, and then presenting the efforts of those research efforts back into a classroom environment. How do we actually sit down with faculty and say, this is what we're finding here? Give us your feedback. We're presenting you with your information. Now you tell me what your opinion of this information is.
Let me ask you a question that's come up. When you were looking and mining through the data, and I hear what you're saying about, part of the challenge is that you can sort of cherry pick, if you will, which pieces of data you're going to be using for whatever purpose it is. Do you feel like the way that the data that exists now, that it's all there, it's just a matter of understanding it and creating some guidelines around its use? Or do you think that there are some gaps, some questions that still remain unanswered based on the data set that campuses are currently collecting?
It depends on the question that you want to ask. But in my very brief experience with this, there's a lot of information we could be gathering. Whether we have legal access or moral rights to that information, I don't know, and that's going to be a conversation from somebody else. But I think there's, at a personal level, there's a lot we can do to characterize veterans, not just veterans, anybody, on an individual basis. We can be tracking their academic process. We can be tracking their academic success. We could be looping in other things that relates to the vets, such as, do they have children? They have part-time jobs? And then we can get some really actionable sort of stuff on that. But in the process of doing that, are we going a little bit too far in asking for information that can be a little bit too personal on an individual basis? Like for instance, if we're tracking a veteran's, and I'm just pulling this off the top of my head, the amount of money that they spend on campus, or we start getting GIS information on veterans, they're walking around on campus. We can ask questions like, well, how often do they go to the library? Things like that. From a research point of view, that might be interesting. But from a personal freedom and privacy point of view, are we going too far? I think I might be diverging a little bit from the intent of your question, but to answer it just in general terms, yes, there's more we can do, but how can we ask those questions in a transparent fashion and in a relevant fashion and in a fashion that respects the rights of the people that we're trying to survey.
It seems, I think that's well said, and it seems that, and Patrick, this may be more in your purview, but there is perhaps a tension between, needing to have more and more and more data in order to, whether it's get funding institutionally or from external donors. Folks aren't aware, Colorado is not on the top of the list for state funding for public higher education institutions. So it's a tough fiscal environment for some offices and departments to get funding. So there's a tension between that, and then, as Daryl was talking about, sort of how much information is really helping you and your office to do your job more effectively, and how much is sort of being driven by external demands like funding or, needing to, you need to pay staff.
Yeah. I guess I'm confused what the question you're asking.
Do you guys have those conversations internally? I imagine that there's a certain amount of data collection that would be helpful to you, but then on the other hand, I'm assuming you don't do any external additional surveying of the folks that you serve through your student veteran office.
We do a little bit external, but no, you're absolutely right. And I think the problem is we as an office want this data, but I don't think other entities across campus see the value of the data. We see it obviously because we're looking for additional staffing, we're looking for program opportunities, we're looking for donor funds, where their information, the stuff they need, is not as important, I think, personally. Sometimes. Again, that gap is, and this is where we're trying to bridge that gap, is we have built our own reports. We've really worked on making sure we were getting as much data to pull in terms of making sure students were self-identifying. Anytime we identify a student, looking in the system and make sure they have been coded. And now we're at the point, and we just did a report last week. We're running reports at the same time. Because our reports are different. They're real-time action, where some of the other reports are snapshots at a certain point. And so now we're getting ready to compare the reports and see, okay, is our data the same? Because that's also a challenge, especially with administration. I'm reporting out a certain amount of numbers, but they're getting a different number from another reporting source. So.
Yeah, that seems very confusing, actually. So we have a question come in, and this could be for either one of you, but if you had to pick what the most important and or consistent data to collect is across campuses, what would you identify that as being?
I would probably, at this point, say how long it takes you to complete your program requirements, what your GPA was at that time, and then take that information and then make the comparison with the population at large.
I think the two I would say is obviously enrollment. That's a big one that we're reporting out. But again, even in the main goals of my university is going to be that graduation retention rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a feeling that's pretty consistent across a lot of institutions of higher education. I mean, not just for Colorado, but nationally speaking. So how will this work continue forward? Whether it's, Daryl, you're at the end of coming to the end of your AmeriCorps Vista term with UCD. So what is the plan moving forward to continue this work for UCD?
Well, Patrick and I are in discussion about that right now. There might be some research opportunities that he can fund. So there's that. And also, too, there might be other opportunities beyond the UCD campus. I see a lot of opportunities to basically go out and do a medicine show with this. At one level, you can go in and you can dig up the numbers, but at another level, I think if you disseminate the efforts of other institutions, you can maybe get a little bit of a synergy going and momentum going, and then two things. One, have people dig into the requirements a little bit more, And that's something that has to be done. So you should be able to sell that pretty easily. But then while they're doing that, they should be able to get information out of that can support their local programs. And then along the way, maybe the grand scheme of all this is there's more interaction with these institutions in terms of their numbers. If an institution is suffering in some fashion or another because of lack of funding or lack of support or lack of commitment, maybe there's opportunities to reach out and say, okay, institution XYZ is doing this and this is what they're coming out of it. How come we're not there with them on that sort of thing? So, maybe a little intercollegiate competition would be good on that, or just this motivation for this is a necessary process that we have to go through. Obviously, when you have colleges, everybody's got a lot on their plates. You have veterans. Veterans are important, obviously, but they're not the only important group there. So everybody has to fight for recognition. Everybody has to fight for resource, and in my world, that resource is access to data, and then the opportunity to turn that data into information.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Patrick.
And just to kind of expand on kind of where we see ourselves moving forward, I think the biggest thing is start nurturing these relationships we've developed. Now that we have access, that we have identified someone that can build pretty specific reports. That's been beneficial. We're going to continue to figure out better ways to identify our student veterans. And I think that's across the whole campuses with different colleges and stuff, because if we can't identify them, it's going to be difficult to report on them. Excuse me. And then again, like I said, we are trying to figure out should we be running reports each semester? Is it annually? Whose information should we be using? Who's going to take responsibility of running these reports? Who's going to be reporting out this information? I mean, I just had to report information to iPads, obviously, and they're coming through my office, but they're also going through institutional research. And again, is our numbers the same?
Yeah. It seems like, too, once you set up a process for doing this, I would imagine there would be other departments or folks that work with, as Daryl was saying, the student that or military affiliated population is just one population of students at UCD, that this really could be replicable to really any sort of identified group of students if folks were wanting to think about how to pull reliable data for anybody. I mean, whether it's first generation to college or in certain fields of departments, whatever it is, that it really could be useful across campus. We have one more question, then we're going to be running out of time. But do you have any ideas related to determining completion rates for vets that have transferred out of your institution?
Yes, there actually is a resource for that. There's a certain clearinghouse that universities can go to that is run by the feds. You can't get extremely specific information. Like for instance, you can't send out a social security number and say, tell me what this individual did after they left, let's say University of Colorado or Denver. What you can do is send information out where you have their full name, perhaps date of birth, perhaps years of attendance, and then you ask this warehouse, what did this individual do after they left UCD? And then in a general sense, you can get information back, and that helps you ascertain graduation rates in not a specific fashion necessarily, because you don't know absolutely for sure that the information you're getting on this individual is really and truly the individual that was in your institution. Mm-hmm. There's that intentional masking there, and again, because of cybersecurity, FERPA, social security numbers getting hijacked, all that sort of stuff. You can never be sure that you're going to be 100% correct on that sort of thing, but you can get a pretty good feel. Like maybe if your information is 80% accurate, that's probably pretty darn good. And if you have information that's got that kind of accuracy to it, you can develop models that say pretty much this is what happens when a student leaves our institution. They go elsewhere.
And I think this is the $1 million question. I know the National Clearinghouse is working with a lot of different national service organizations to answer these questions, again, for the VA requirements. It's a big thing down at the community college level because that's one of the reasons community colleges are afraid to report some of this data because it doesn't accurately represent their numbers. So.
And then are you referring to, the NCES, that's the database you're talking about?
Yeah.
I presume so.
The National Center for Education Stats?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, just in case folks on the call weren't familiar. And it's exactly 2 o'clock. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the last slide. So for folks that are hanging in there with us, we're going to include on the slides we send out. And I will, and there's the link right there to what Daryl was just and Patrick were just talking about. But this has live links to the Principles of Excellence. This is a panel that was done about the Principles of Excellence, and it goes through pretty good detail about them, more information about UCD's Veteran Student Services and about us. I'm going to let folks that are wanting to go. Daryl, I'm going to ask you one more question that came in, even though I know we're a little bit over time. But do you guys request numbers from your internet, your research office that you do comparisons on?
We just started doing that. So we in the past, we received data from institutional research, but then we also had data that we were obtaining through reports that we run that have been built specifically for my office. And that's what I was just speaking of what we did last week. Is now we're each running a report at essentially what should be the same time. Again, mine is always live data and it updates the very next day. Whereas institutional research, they do a snapshot on a certain point in time. And so we had to identify, okay, when that certain point in time happens, we'll run our report at the same time to kind of get a better idea of where there might be a disconnect in our numbers.
That's awesome. All right. Thank you all very much for joining us for this webinar. Hopefully it was informative and you got something out of it that is going to be helpful as you go back and start thinking about some of these issues for your own institution. As I mentioned before, we'll send out an email with a brief link, or it's not a brief link, it's a brief evaluation that we'll provide a link to, along with the PowerPoint slides and a link to this presentation on YouTube. Thank you very much, Daryl and Patrick. Thank you, Katie. And everyone have an awesome day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.